In this session, we're going to discuss the promise of urbanization. We go back in time, we look over 3 to 4 centuries, we try and split up the world between North and Latin America, we look at Asia and Africa, and then we try and unpack what are the drivers of urbanization, because this is really the starting point for your learning journey. And what we will then do is relate that to different kinds of urban settlement sizes. Because again, whether you live in a tiny town or whether you live in a large metropolitan region makes an enormous difference in terms of what is possible from a policy point of view. And once we've set the empirical context, we can then begin to say, why is urbanization so important for this bigger civilizational conversation about sustainable development? And that sets the stage for us then to understand, will in the 21st century be urbanization a force for good or for bad for Africa's future? So let's get going and let's dive in. So this is a very wordy slide, but what we do in the world is we all rely on the United Nations. They are entrusted by nation states to collect all of the data about just about everything, but including urbanization. So they have a specific definition, and it is useful to dive into that because all of the numbers and the graphs and the charts that you will see and that you will explore is derived from a data set that they are the custodians of. And they say that urbanization is a very complex socioeconomic process that transforms the built environment, shifting the spatial distribution of a population from rural to urban areas. And it includes changes in dominant occupations, lifestyles, cultures, and behavior. And thus it alters the demographic and the social structure of both urban and rural areas. And most importantly, in a context like Africa, that in-between zone, what we call the peri-urban area, where a lot of very poor people live. Now, a major consequence of urbanization is a rise in the number, the size of the land area, and the population size of urban settlements, and the number and the share of urban residents compared to rural dwellers. The number of people who live in urban areas are growing faster than the number of people living in rural areas. And so we've seen over time that urbanization can also refer to the increase in the percentage of populations who are in areas, in other words, natural population growth, and that is associated growth in the number of urban dwellers, in the sizes of cities, and in the total area occupied by urban settlement. Now, maybe an easier definition comes from the academic Sean Fox, where he says that urban population growth is a function of 3 factors. Endogenous population growth, in other words, people who are in the city already, and the natural population growth, in-migration from rural areas, and the transformation of previously rural areas into urban areas once the classification system changes. Now, using that as a backdrop, drawing on the data of the United Nations, what we can see is that we are living at the tail end of a dramatic demographic process over the last 250 or 300 years. And we mark this as the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Now, you will hear this concept quite often because what we've noticed is that as the global economy and national economies industrialized because of technological changes, we saw the commencement of people moving off agricultural lands, off the farms, into the urban areas to work in factories. And this, of course, coincided with the fact that the global population has also increased dramatically. So for quite some time, rural areas continued to grow quite rapidly, but increasingly urban settlements expanded, and especially after the 19th century. For us, and for the purpose of understanding why urbanization is very special and unique in Africa, it is important to take a long historical view. So what we do is we divide the stories of urbanization into 2 chapters. In the first chapter, we look at what is going on in what we call the global north. These are industrialized countries, or what we in shorthand could call the West. And that's the first wave of urbanization. So what we see there is that when industrialization started in 1750s, that rural to urban migration set in. And it took them about 200 years to go from only 10% urban population to over 50%. Now, that exact same historical process, you would not believe this, but that is unfolding in just 80 years in the global south. This is what we call the second urbanization wave. And this is where the urban population in 1950 was just 18%. And by 2030, when we will measure the Sustainable Development Goals, that would have jumped up to well over 50%. In 1950, in the global north, there were almost 430 million people living in urban areas. That same number, the percentage of people living in urban areas in the global south, by 2030 will be almost 4 billion. So just for a moment, pause and reflect, what does that mean? The global north had to figure out how to manage urbanization over a 200-year period, and at the height of that, they were only dealing with about 420 million people and the benefit of the global industrial economy, which of course was premised on slavery and colonialism. In the global south, we're talking about a much shorter period where we've got to manage the lives of 4 billion people without slavery and colonialism, and as you can imagine, in a very different global moment in terms of the global economy. Let's come back to this key moment of 1950. So remember, after the Second World War, right at the cusp of the end of the colonial era, a lot of countries will start to gain their colonial independence between the 1950s and 1960s. And what we see in this graph is the different story for different world regions. And what it shows is that all the world regions, Latin America and the Caribbean, North America, Europe, they've all had very high urbanization numbers in the 20th century. They were well above 40 and 50%, and they've now almost at 80 to 90%, especially in Latin America. But in Asia and Africa, it's a totally different story. By 1950, they were only 15 to 18% urbanized, and still today, Africa is still only 43% urbanized. We haven't yet passed that 50% mark. And this is why Africa and Asia is central to the urban story in the 22nd century, because what we know is that almost all of the urban growth between now and the end of the century will only be in Africa and Asia. There's a second part to the story. Yes, cities are growing, and in our minds, we begin to think of big metropolitan areas. We think of large cities like London, New York. We even think of others, maybe Lagos, Johannesburg. But actually, if you unpack this, what it shows is that the majority of people in cities actually live in very small places, places that are less than 300,000, less than 500,000. And in fact, in Africa, 65% of the urban population are in settlements that are either below 500,000 people or between 500,000 and 1 million. The big, large metropolitan areas are actually a small proportion of the urban population. Now, why does urbanization happen? What we know from the literature and from research is that there's 3 main drivers. One, people, of course, go and look for work. Secondly, people try and access social development opportunities, and what we know is that health and education infrastructures tend to be better in urban areas because it is easier to invest where there's a lot of people living together. And thirdly, of course, are those terrible things like famine, war, and other natural disasters. And since we're right in the middle of a climate change disaster story, we know that this drive of urbanization will become even more important. Why is urbanization so important for sustainable development, you may ask? Firstly, we know that we've never had a country or a region in the world that is able to increase the income per household or per individual in overall terms in the absence of urbanization. The more we see urbanization, the more likely it is that household incomes will go up. Secondly, social development investment outcomes tend to be better in cities. Thirdly, it is a little bit cheaper to provide basic infrastructure to people when they're in cities because of something the economist calls economies of scale. In other words, when you have 20,000 people living in a neighborhood, to provide electricity, water, and roads to them is cheaper per unit of investment than if you have 20,000 people living spread out across a vast rural agricultural landscape. The second and the third factors here, we also know that cities have this amazing energy, or what the economists like to call multiplier effects. Healthier populations are more likely to get better education outcomes, and therefore they can access a wider array of opportunities in the labor market, opportunities that pay better salaries, which means they can invest more in their children's education, and so the circle continues. Cities also provide the best context for the production of new ideas and innovation. And this is the lifeblood of any economic story. And lastly, we know that it is also easier to adapt to the difficulties and the problems that climate change will present as it intensifies. This goes back to the same reason that it's a little bit cheaper to provide the necessary defensive infrastructures to manage the fallout of climate change. So these are some of the ways in which urbanization is really important for thinking about how do we make sustainable development a reality for the largest number of people in a given country. Now, the final point in setting this context that I want to leave you with is something that is really difficult for both researchers, for policy leaders, and for communities who live in African cities in particular. And this is the fact that the main way in which people make a living and how they live is informal. The high levels of informal employment in African cities mean that most young people who enter the labor market only earn very low and irregular incomes. And this makes it almost impossible to enhance both the individual and their business level productivity. And so what this means is that without economic infrastructure, without infrastructure to support healthy families and households, the potential of Africa's youthful labor force is squandered. And instead of this amazing asset being a resource that catapults the continent into the future, we run the risk that these young people can become a source of frustration and destabilization, as we've seen. Thank you for your attention. I hope that you now feel you are grounded in why urbanization matters and you're ready for the rest of this learning journey.